My name is Olivia Harper. I just turned 30, and I used to think Christmas dinner was about family love and tradition. But that night in Greenwich, while the tree sparkled and the fire cracked, I found myself sitting across from a father who saw my work as useless, and a sister who smirked at every word I spoke. The table was set with silver and wine, but what they placed in front of me was a decision meant to erase 8 years of my life. I remember the sound of his pen scratching the paper, the weight of silence pressing in. And then, just as the ink began to dry, something happened that none of them could have imagined. The question is, what do you do when your family tries to sell your future for pennies, and you suddenly realize you hold the kind of power they never dreamed you had? Stay with me, because this story is one they never saw coming. Let me take you back to where it began. The crystal glasses caught the glow of the Christmas tree as I stepped into the dining room of the Harper estate in Greenwich. The long table was dressed in deep red linen, polished silver, and candles that flickered against the dark windows. My black dress felt too simple, too plain, compared to the glitter of my sister Kate's gown and the pearls around my mother's neck. I had my laptop bag with me, heavier than it should have been, resting against my leg like a quiet reminder of what I carried inside. My father Richard stood at the head of the table with a bottle of wine in his hand, his voice commanding as always. He poured Bordeaux into each glass, pausing dramatically before raising his own. He smiled at Kate, first, then at my mother, then finally let his eyes land on me. As the family settled into their seats, the fire crackled behind us, and the scent of roasted ham filled the room. For a moment, it almost felt like the holidays I used to dream about, when I was little, a family bound together by warmth and love. That feeling dissolved the instant my father cleared his throat. "Olivia," he said, swirling his glass slowly, "we need to discuss your research." Kate leaned forward, eyes bright with mischief, as if she had been waiting for this. My mother Elaine dabbed her lips with her napkin, not looking at me directly. My fork hovered above the plate, the steam from the vegetables curling upward. My chest tightened. "What about it, Dad?" He set down his glass with a soft clink and reached for a folder that had been waiting beside his plate. He slid it across the mahogany table until it stopped in front of me. "We are selling it." I blinked. "Selling what?" "Your research division," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "The board believes it is time to cut our losses. Global Tech is offering $2 million. That is generous considering what little has come from it." Kate lifted her glass with a smirk. "Finally, that basement lab has been embarrassing us long enough." My stomach lurched. $2 million. The words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I thought of the years of sleepless nights, the equations that had consumed me, the simulations I had built, line by line. "But we are so close," I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. "The tests are showing stability. We are right on the edge of something extraordinary." Kate let out a laugh, a sharp sound that bounced off the high ceiling. "Promising is not profitable, little sister." My father cut in before I could answer. "Enough. This company needs certainty, not theories." He tapped the folder with his finger. "I expect you to sign, tonight." My mother finally looked at me, her eyes soft but distant, as if she were already resigned. "Darling, it is time to move on. Kate's division is bringing in real revenue. You should think about something more practical." I set down my fork, my hands trembling under the table. Practical. That word had followed me all my life, thrown at me whenever I dreamed too big. Kate's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "While you play with equations in the dark, the rest of us are actually building something." I leaned back, swallowing hard. "By copying what other companies already built, you mean?" Her smile widened, sharp as glass. "By making money," she said, her tone triumphant. My father pushed the papers closer. "Sign them." His Montblanc pen was already uncapped, waiting. I stared at the neat lines of text. Transfer of ownership. Sale of assets. Global Tech. $2 million. My throat burned. The weight of my laptop bag pressed against my leg. "Dad, you do not understand what you are doing. The applications alone could change everything." "Worthless without proof," he snapped. His voice filled the room, leaving no space for argument. Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint hum of Christmas music playing from the old stereo. I glanced at my mother, searching for some sign of doubt, but she only lowered her eyes. Kate sipped her wine, victorious already. My father lifted the pen, his hand steady, his face calm. "It is time to join the real world, Olivia." The tip of the pen touched the page. I felt my breath catch in my chest, my pulse racing so loud it drowned out the carols. I clenched my hands under the table, fighting the urge to shout, to scream, to grab the papers and tear them apart. Instead, I sat perfectly still, the candlelight flickering across the polished wood, and watched the ink begin to flow. I was no longer at that table in Greenwich. My eyes fixed on the ink staining the paper, but my mind slipped backward, carried into the years when I was small, and already learning what it meant to be invisible in my own family. I remembered a Christmas morning when I was 8. Kate tore the paper off a gleaming dollhouse, taller than she was, its lights already glowing as our father plugged it in. She squealed and clapped while I sat beside a small stack of books wrapped in plain paper. They were science encyclopedias, secondhand, their corners bent. My mother had smiled and said I should be grateful that knowledge was more important than toys. I had hugged the books to my chest anyway, though the sting in my throat made it hard to swallow. That was always the pattern. Kate's birthdays meant bicycles and designer clothes once she was older. Mine meant things like calculators or hand-me-down coats. Our father adored showing off Kate at dinner parties, dressed in sequins, laughing loud. He would introduce her as the daughter destined to carry the family name into the future. When it came to me, he would clear his throat and mutter that I was good with numbers, as if it were a mild embarrassment. I learned to keep to the edges of rooms, to sit quietly with my notebooks while the others drank champagne. There were nights I stayed awake in my little attic room, pencil smudging my fingers as I copied equations from library books. My lamp burned long after the rest of the house went dark. The only person who ever saw me was my grandmother Ruth. She would slip upstairs with a plate of cookies, her silver hair tied in a bun, her sharp eyes softened only for me. She would sit on the edge of my bed, watch me scribble, and nod as if the scribbles were gold. She told me that brilliance was often ignored until it could no longer be denied. She pressed my hand and whispered that I must never let anyone cage my mind. When she passed in 2018, the house felt emptier than ever. At the reading of her will, Kate received jewelry and antiques, things she could parade at galas. I sat stunned when the lawyer announced that the trust fund, $15 million, was left entirely to me. My father's face flushed dark red. My mother's lips tightened. Kate gasped as though she had been robbed. I wanted to sink into the floor. But I also knew in that moment that my grandmother had seen what no one else did. I used that trust to fund the research they all mocked. In 2015, I had started shaping my idea scribbles on loose paper that I carried everywhere. By 2019, I was renting a tiny lab space in Cambridge near MIT, hiding my name behind shell companies so no one could trace the money. Every year, I worked harder, sometimes sleeping on the lab floor, waking up with the hum of servers in my ears. While Kate was plastered across business magazines for recycling other companies' ideas, I was running simulations on quantum stability testing and failing, then testing again. I thought about those nights as I sat at that Christmas table, the music humming faintly in the background. My father had never asked me what kept me in the lab so long. My mother had never once visited. Kate had visited once, only to laugh when she saw my walls covered in chalk dust equations. She had told me it looked like a madhouse. I had locked the door behind her and sworn she would never set foot inside again. The memories came fast, one stacking on another. I saw myself at 13 standing in our kitchen clutching a science fair ribbon. Kate had won first place at a regional dance competition that same weekend. Our parents had thrown her a party with cake and balloons. My ribbon sat unnoticed on the counter until Grandma picked it up and pinned it to the refrigerator. I heard Grandma's voice again, low and steady, reminding me that patience was its own kind of strength. She had seen the loneliness in my eyes, the way I forced myself to smile at Kate's victories. She told me that envy was wasted energy, that I would win in my own time. The candlelight flickered in the present, snapping me back, but the weight of all those years pressed on my chest. Every slight, every dismissal, every mocking smile from Kate had carried me to this moment. They thought I was weak because I stayed silent. They thought I was a failure because I had no stage, no glittering lights, no applause. But I had been building something they could not see. I stared at the ink flowing across the page under my father's hand. My pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was from the memory of Grandma's last Christmas with us. She had given me a thin gold bracelet and whispered that one day they would regret underestimating me. I wore that bracelet now, under the sleeve of my dress. I slid my fingers over it, grounding myself. Kate's laugh broke through my thoughts. She lifted her glass in a mocking toast, her eyes glinting with victory. My mother gave her a proud smile. My father pressed down harder on the pen, as if signing away my work was an act of mercy. I breathed slowly, keeping my face calm. Inside, I saw the long nights in the lab, the sleepless mornings, the equations that spun into patterns. Only I seemed to understand. I remembered the first time I ran a stability test, and the particles held together for longer than a second. I had cried alone at the console, clutching the data as if it were a newborn child. That memory steadied me as the present blurred into focus. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while every piece of my past lined up behind me, giving me strength. My grandmother's trust, the attic lamp, the science fair ribbon, the hum of servers in a rented lab, the taste of tears when no one believed in me. All of it pointed toward this moment. The fire snapped loudly, startling even my mother. The pen scratched louder across the paper. My heart hammered, but I did not flinch. I was not 8 anymore, clutching bent encyclopedias while my sisters shrieked with delight over a dollhouse. I was not 13 with a forgotten ribbon. I was 30, and every hour of being overlooked had prepared me for this. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and let my eyes rest on the folder in front of me, waiting for the ink to dry. The scratch of my father's pen cut through the hum of carols playing in the background, each stroke a verdict. He leaned back with a sigh of satisfaction, the corners of his mouth tightening into what he must have thought was triumph. Kate clapped her hands together softly, as if applauding a performance she had been waiting her whole life to see. Richard pushed the folder toward me with finality. 2 million, he said, his voice steady, his eyes cold. That is more than fair for what amounts to nothing but failed experiments. My chest constricted. I glanced at the numbers written on the page and the line where he had signed. The words "transfer of ownership" blurred before me. My fork lay abandoned beside my untouched ham, the steam long gone. Kate leaned closer, her perfume sweet and cloying. "You should thank him, Liv. He just saved you from wasting another decade chasing after shadows." My mouth opened, but no sound came. For years, I had pictured myself defending my work, showing them what I had achieved, proving to them that I was not the disappointment they believed. Now the moment was here, and I sat mute, my throat raw. My mother lifted her glass, her smile meant to soothe, but only deepening the cut. "You will see it is for the best, darling. Your sister's projects bring in revenue, bring us respect. It is time you follow a more practical path." That word again, practical. It rolled through me like poison. All my life it had been their cage for me. A practical major, a practical job, a practical life. While Kate sparkled in designer gowns, I was told to dim myself down to something manageable. I reached for the folder slowly, the weight of my hand feeling unnatural, my fingers trembling as if I were touching fire. The crisp edges dug into my skin. I looked up at my father. "Did you even read my reports?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Reports mean nothing without results. Global Tech has real scientists who can make use of whatever scraps you left behind." Scraps. The word hit me harder than I expected. My mind flashed to nights in Cambridge, hunched over a console watching the monitor as data lined up in delicate patterns. I remembered the hum of the servers, the warmth of stale coffee, the tears I wiped away with the back of my sleeve when the numbers finally aligned. Kate swirled her wine, her eyes never leaving my face. "Do not look so wounded, little sister. Not everyone is meant to lead. Some of us shine, some of us support. That is just life. I wanted to scream that she had never built anything, that all her accolades were stolen pieces from people who could not fight back. But the words stayed lodged in my chest. The pen still lay beside the contract, its black ink gleaming in the candlelight. My father gestured to it. "Sign, Olivia. End this foolishness." The fire crackled behind us, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The golden ornaments on the tree reflected tiny bursts of light. I stared at them as if they could offer an escape, but there was none. I closed the folder, pushing it back toward him. My voice came out steady, though my insides shook. $2 million for 8 years of work. For technology you do not even understand. Richard's eyes narrowed. Do not be dramatic. Take it as a lesson. Sometimes dreams are just that, dreams. My mother reached for his hand, nodding gently. He is right, Olivia. You will find something else, something more suitable. My laugh surprised even me, a short, sharp sound that broke through the heavy air. Suitable. Is that what you call stealing from your own daughter on Christmas Eve? The room froze. Kate's smile faltered for the briefest second before she recovered her tone, syrupy sweet. That is unfair. We are helping you. You will see it in time. I pressed my palm flat against the table to steady myself. My heart thudded, but the fear that had always followed me in their presence felt different now, sharper, almost ready to turn into something else. I thought again of my grandmother's words whispered years ago, her hand squeezing mine in that upstairs room. Never let them cage your brilliance. The memory pulsed inside me, stronger than the sting of their dismissals. My father thought he had ended me with a signature. My sister thought she had buried me with mockery. My mother thought she had soothed me with condescension. What they did not know was that the cage had never been locked. I lifted my eyes to meet my father's, then Kate's, then my mother's, my voice low, almost calm. This is not over. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the hiss of wax dripping down a candle. I sat straighter, my hands folded, my face unreadable, while inside me something uncoiled and steadied itself. The ink on the page gleamed final and damning in their minds, but to me it was only the beginning. My phone buzzed so loudly against my lap that I thought for a moment it might shatter the tense silence around the table. I fumbled for it, my fingers shaking, the glow of the screen lighting up my face in the candlelight. 3 alerts lined up one after another, each more unreal than the last. Patent approved. Breakthrough status confirmed. Bidding starts at $2 billion. The words blurred before me, and for a moment, I wondered if grief and rage had finally driven me to hallucinations. But the vibration kept pulsing, a steady reminder that this was real, so achingly real that I had to catch my breath. Kate's wineglass froze halfway to her lips, her eyes darting to my screen. What is it? I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment, then turned the phone around for all of them to see. The glow cast across their stunned faces, washing out the smugness I had endured all evening. My father's mouth parted, his voice gone. My mother's hand slipped, her fork clattering onto the china. Kate choked on her own breath, her lips trembling as though she had seen a ghost. I leaned back, calm settling into me like warm water. $2 billion, I said, my voice steady though my heart pounded. That is what they think of your scraps. The grandfather clock ticked, the fire hissed, and not one of them moved. The pen rolled slightly across the table, forgotten. My father reached for his glass, but his hand shook. That is impossible. I shook my head. No, Dad. What is impossible is you thinking I spent 8 years of my life chasing shadows. What is impossible is you believing you could sell me off for pennies while I sat here quietly. Kate's voice cracked. $2 billion. That cannot be right. I let out a small laugh, not cruel, just tired. Maybe if you had paid attention to something other than appearances, you would not be so surprised. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her pearls. Olivia, we need to discuss this calmly. I slid the phone back toward myself, locking the screen. Calm is exactly what I am. You are the ones shaking. Richard's face darkened, his pride clawing for purchase. This changes nothing. You are still under my company. Not anymore, I whispered, though the words carried like thunder in that grand dining room. I thought of my grandmother then, her voice steady, her hand warm around mine. She had known this day would come. She had prepared me for their disbelief, their anger, their betrayal. I felt her presence so sharply that I pressed my bracelet against my wrist, grounding myself. Kate knocked over her wineglass, the red liquid bleeding into the white tablecloth. She did not even notice. She was too busy staring at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. My father pushed back his chair and stood towering as he always did, his shadow stretching across the table. You think this makes you powerful? Do you think a notification on a phone gives you the right to defy me? I met his gaze, no longer shrinking under it. No, Dad. What gives me the right is the work itself. The truth. And the fact that while you were so busy dismissing me, the world was waiting for me. The words hung in the air, heavier than any ornament on the tree. The carols playing softly from the stereo sounded strange now, like a soundtrack to a life I no longer belonged to. For years I had dreamed of recognition, of respect, of being seen. But in that moment I realized it was never about them seeing me. It was about me seeing myself, knowing I had never been small, never been weak, never been the disappointment they wanted me to believe. The phone buzzed again, another alert, another message I did not even bother to open. I no longer needed to. The point had already been made. My father sank back into his chair, his shoulders heavy. My mother whispered my name, but I did not answer. Kate sat pale and silent, her manicured hand gripping the edge of the table, as if the world were slipping out from under her. I folded my napkin, laid it carefully beside my untouched plate, and let the silence grow until it was unbearable. Then I looked each of them in the eye, one by one, and smiled. The dinner was over, at least for me. I stood from the table and felt every pair of eyes following me. The music still played faintly in the background, a carol about peace on earth, but in that room there was none. My chair scraped against the polished floor as I pushed it back, the sound sharp and final. I gathered my laptop bag from beside me, its strap rough against my palm. Kate's voice broke the silence, first high and trembling. You cannot just walk away like this. You belong to this family, to this company. I turned toward her, slowly meeting her glare with a calm that surprised even me. No, Kate. I do not belong to anyone. Her face twisted, her wine-stained fingers clenching the edge of the table. She wanted to say more, but the words stuck. My father leaned forward, his voice heavy. Do you really think a few papers and alerts mean you have any power here? This house, this company, everything you touch came from me. I almost laughed at that, but instead, I set my bag on the table and unzipped it. The sound of the zipper running open seemed to echo through the dining room. I pulled out a thin stack of documents and laid them on top of his contract, covering the ink he had been so proud to leave. I paid for every bit of this research with money Grandma left me. Not a cent from Harper Dynamics. You never once funded me. Not once. My mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. Richard glanced at her, then back at me, his jaw tight. Kate spat out the words like venom. Liar. I met her eyes without blinking. You know it is true. You always knew. That is why you kept trying to peek at my work, why you whispered to Dad that I was wasting his name. You wanted it. You wanted to steal it the way you stole everything else. Her cheeks flushed, scarlet, her lips parting, but no defense came. I opened another folder from my bag, sliding page after page across the linen tablecloth. Patent certificates, all stamped, all official. Not one, but 12. Richard picked one up, his hand shaking, his eyes scanning the legal print, his face drained of color. Kate leaned over, snatched a page from his hand, and flipped through it frantically. She muttered under her breath, her nails scratching against the seal. I rested my hand on the pile, steady, firm. These are mine. Filed under my name, with my funds protected under federal law. My father's voice faltered for the first time that evening. But the company, the board, I cut him off. The company has nothing. You have nothing. You tried to sell what was never yours. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. My mother shifted in her chair, her voice small, almost pleading. Olivia, surely we can talk this through as a family. Family. The words stung in a way I did not expect. I thought of Grandma's voice again, steady and unwavering, telling me not to let them cage me. My eyes burned, but I refused to let tears fall. Kate slammed the page back onto the table, her voice rising. "You cannot do this. You cannot humiliate us like this." I picked up my phone, tapping it awake, showing the unopened alerts still glowing. Patent approved. Breakthrough confirmed. Bidding starts at $2 billion. I set it down gently in front of them, my fingers brushing the tablecloth where the spilled wine had already begun to dry. "You humiliated yourselves." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping back, his shadow looming across the table. "You think you are clever, but the company will fight this. The lawyers will fight this." I lifted my chin. "Let them. Every contract, every receipt, every patent, every dime of funding is mine." Kate's hand trembled as she pointed at me. "You played us." I smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. No Kate. I protected myself from the people who should have been protecting me. The clock chimed 9, the sound deep and resonant, rolling through the silence that followed. My father lowered himself back into his chair heavily, as though the years had caught up to him all at once. My mother stared at the papers, her lips moving as if in prayer. Kate sat rigid, her glass, forgotten, her knuckles white against the table. I reached for my bag again, sliding the documents neatly inside. My movements were deliberate, calm, as though this were just another experiment completed, another proof written down. I zipped it shut and placed the strap over my shoulder. The air in the room felt heavy, but I breathed easily. For the first time in years, I was not the one shrinking into the shadows. As I walked toward the door, I paused beside the Christmas tree, its lights twinkling against the dark window. The scent of pine filled my nose, sharp and clean. I turned slightly, catching their faces one last time in the glow. "You wanted me small, you wanted me silent, but I was never either of those things." I left the dining room, then my footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving behind the spilled wine, the scattered papers, and the weight of every Christmas past. The night air outside the Harper estate was crisp, sharp enough to sting my cheeks as I stepped onto the stone porch. I drew in a long breath, letting the cold burn away the heaviness clinging to me from the dining room. For the first time in years, I felt steady, like the ground beneath me belonged to me alone. The driveway stretched out in front of me, lined with bare trees wrapped in twinkling white lights, but I hardly noticed the beauty. My phone buzzed again in my bag, insistent, reminding me that the world outside these walls was already moving. I unlocked it with trembling fingers. Another message from the patent office, this one flagged as urgent. I skimmed it quickly. Federal confirmation of ownership, legal protection, activated immediate advisement to secure counsel. Beneath it was another alert, this time from my attorney, Mark Stevens. He had left a voicemail. My pulse kicked up. I called him back before I even reached my car. The line clicked and his voice came through, calm but firm. "Olivia, I was waiting for you to call. I trust you saw the news." I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against my back. "They know, Mark. My family knows everything." "Good," he said simply. "Then it is time we move forward. The paperwork is solid. You are the legal owner of the patents, and the trust fund trail is clean. But there is more." He hesitated. "Your father's signature tonight triggered a clause." My grip on the phone tightened. "What clause?" "The one I told you to initial last month. Page 47, paragraph 3. In the event of attempted forced transfer of intellectual property, voting shares, shift. Olivia, as of tonight, you are the majority shareholder of Harper Dynamics." The words landed heavy like a stone dropped into deep water. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, the leather cold under my skin. They thought they were ending me. They just handed me the company. Mark's voice steadied me. "I will bring the full documents in the morning. But you need to prepare yourself. Your father will fight this. Kate will scream. Elaine will try to smooth it over. But the law is on your side." I closed my eyes, hearing again my father's voice inside, so sure, so dismissive. The taste of his certainty still lingered like bitterness in my mouth. "When can we meet?" I asked. "First thing. 9 a.m. My office in Manhattan, and Olivia, his voice softened. This is your moment. Do not let them make you small again. The line went dead, and I sat there for a long minute, the engine off the quiet, wrapping around me like a blanket. The estate loomed behind me, its windows glowing warm and golden, but all I saw was a cage I had finally stepped out of. By the time I reached my apartment in Brooklyn, it was past midnight. The city lights flickered outside my window, familiar and grounding. I set my bag on the kitchen counter and pulled out the papers I had shown at dinner. The seals, the signatures, the dates. 12 patents, each one more valuable than the last. My hands shook as I spread them out, not from fear but from the weight of what they meant. Another buzz rattled the counter. This time, it was an email not from the patent office, but from a name that made my heart race. A representative from Google confirming their interest and raising the opening bid to $2.4 billion. I sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. $2.4 billion. More than my family had ever imagined. More than Harper Dynamics had ever been worth under my father's rule. I shut the laptop with a snap. It was too much to take in all at once. I needed clarity, not dollar signs. What mattered was control, protection, the ability to lead, without them ripping it away. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face as he realized what he had signed. Kate's hand, trembling as she clutched the patent pages, my mother's pearls shifting against her collarbone as her hand shook. I heard my grandmother's voice again, steady and sure, telling me that brilliance was often ignored until it could no longer be denied. When dawn broke, gray light spilling across my apartment, I was already dressed, documents packed neatly in my bag. The subway ride into Manhattan felt surreal. Commuters sat with their coffees, scrolling their phones, unaware that beside them a woman carried the future of a company that had been built on her grandfather's dreams and nearly destroyed by her father's pride. Mark's office overlooked the East River. He was waiting with coffee and a thick folder already open on his desk. He motioned me to sit, his expression unreadable. I dropped into the chair, my nerves buzzing. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were copies of the clause signed by my father, notarized, legally binding. His signature last night activated it. Harper Dynamics is now under your control. I ran my fingers over the papers, tracing the ink, the official stamps. The reality pressed in. My father no longer held the reins. I did. Mark leaned back. The board will not be happy. Some will resist. But the timing is on your side. News of the patents has already leaked. The stock is climbing. Investors are calling. You walk into that boardroom with the upper hand? I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping. What about my family? Mark's mouth tightened. They will fight. But Olivia, the law is not on their side. You have the proof. You have the power. I sat in silence, staring at the river glittering beyond the window. My grandmother's bracelet pressed cool against my wrist as I turned it, grounding myself. For the first time in my life, I was not begging for a seat at the table. I was the one bringing the table. Mark cleared his throat. There is an emergency board meeting scheduled for this afternoon. They called it after hearing about the patents. I suggest you attend. My chest tightened, but it was not fear. It was resolve, sharp and steady. I nodded, sliding the folder back into my bag. By the time I stepped out onto the busy street, the winter wind whipped against my coat, carrying the honk of cabs and the chatter of pedestrians. My phone buzzed again, another message lighting the screen. The Department of Defense requesting an urgent meeting. I stopped on the sidewalk, the city surging around me, the weight of those words settling in. The world was no longer ignoring me. The world was knocking at my door. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag and kept walking, each step carrying me closer to the boardroom where everything would change. The glass doors of Harper Dynamics swung open as I stepped inside the marble lobby, gleaming under the winter Sunday. People moved quickly through the space, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking toward me, and then away just as fast. News had already traveled. I could feel it in the air, a hum of tension beneath the polished calm. The receptionist glanced up, startled, then quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Miss Harper, the board is expecting you upstairs." I nodded, my bag heavy against my shoulder. The elevator ride felt endless, the numbers ticking upward in a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. By the time the doors opened on the executive floor, I had steadied my breath, smoothed my coat, and set my face into calm resolve. The hallway outside the boardroom was crowded. Assistants with clipboards, lawyers whispering in low tones, and a few reporters who had somehow slipped past security. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble, until the double doors opened and the room swallowed me. 14 board members sat around the long mahogany table, their leather chairs pulled close, their expressions tight. My father occupied the head of the table, his posture rigid, his hands clenched on the armrests. Kate sat near him, her eyes sharp and full of fire, though I could see the tremor in her hands. The corporate secretary stood. "This emergency meeting will come to order." His voice shook slightly, betraying the tension. On the screens behind him, the stock ticker scrolled in real time, Harper dynamics climbing higher with every passing minute. "Before we begin," my father said, his tone heavy, "I want to address these ridiculous claims. My daughter has confused personal ambition with corporate responsibility. These patents, if they even exist, belong to Harper Dynamics." I stepped forward before he could continue. "Let us start with facts." Mark Stevens appeared at my side, his presence steady. He handed out thick folders to each board member, the sound of papers sliding across the polished wood filling the silence. "Inside, you will find confirmation from the Federal Patent Office. 12 patents, all filed under my name, all funded through my personal trust. The documents are notarized, the receipts attached." David Chen from the audit committee flipped through the folder, his brows rising as he scanned the pages. He looked up, his voice calm but firm. "These are valid. The trail is clean." "Impossible," Kate burst out, rising from her chair. "She has never even attended a board meeting. She has no idea how this company operates." I smiled faintly, keeping my eyes on her. "Actually, I have attended every meeting this past year." Confusion rippled through the board. I reached into my bag and pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen. The monitors lit up with clips of security footage. Maintenance staff, wheeling carts, junior assistants delivering water, an IT worker adjusting cables. Each clip zoomed in, revealing my face behind subtle disguises. Gasps filled the room. I learned early on that in this building the invisible ones hear everything. While you all underestimated me, I was listening. My father's face flushed, deep red. "This is manipulation, deceit." The board shifted uneasily. They were not used to seeing him rattled. I turned the footage off and tapped another file. Detailed records filled the screens, line after line of stolen innovations, falsified reports, buried research. 5 years of evidence pointing directly to Kate's division. She paled, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "Those are lies. Fabricated." Dr. Rivera's name appeared on the screen along with others who had been silenced under Kate's control. Their research suppressed, their careers destroyed. I looked around the room, letting the silence stretch. "You called it innovation. I call it theft." The weight of the evidence pressed down, filling every corner of the boardroom. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. "Miss Harper, what exactly are you proposing?" I stepped closer to the window, the skyline of New York gleaming beyond the glass. Harper Dynamics was founded on real breakthroughs, on my grandfather's vision. It was never meant to survive on intimidation and stolen work. I am proposing we return to that vision. The stock ticker behind me jumped again, the numbers flashing green. The world outside already believed. Now the board only had to decide whether they would too. My father slammed his palm against the table. "You cannot just walk in here and demand control. This is my company." I turned back to him, my voice steady. "Not anymore." The room fell silent, every eye locked on me. The truth had been laid bare, the choice unavoidable. I slid my grandmother's bracelet higher on my wrist, the metal cool against my skin, and waited. The next move was theirs. The door to the boardroom opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed against the marble. Every head turned as Dr. Maria Rivera entered, followed by a group of faces I recognized instantly. My chest tightened at the sight of them, men and women who had once filled the labs with ideas before Kate forced them out. They walked in slowly, their presence alone louder than any words I could have spoken. Maria carried a folder in her hands, her chin high, her eyes locked on Kate. I remembered the day she had been dismissed, the humiliation written across her face, the way she had gathered her belongings into a cardboard box while security watched. Now she stood taller than I had ever seen her, and her voice steady and sharp broke the silence. I was head of the quantum computing team until your daughter destroyed my work and buried my career. She gestured at Kate, her tone cutting, and she did not stop with me. The others stepped forward, laying documents on the table. Research papers marked confidential projects abruptly shut down, patents blocked. Proof piled high, undeniable and damning. Kate's face drained of color. She pushed back from the table, shaking her head. This is a setup. These people are bitter. They would say anything to get back at me. One of the younger scientists, his voice trembling but clear, spoke up. You told me my work was worthless. Then 6 months later you published it under your own name. My career never recovered. Gasps rippled through the boardroom. The weight of their stories filled the air like smoke. Maria placed her folder directly in front of Mr. Chen. Inside were signed affidavits, dates, emails. She looked straight at him. We were not failures. We were silenced. The board members shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between Kate and the growing pile of evidence. I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. This is what passes for leadership under your current regime: theft, intimidation, destruction of talent. If this continues, there will be nothing left of Harper Dynamics worth saving. Kate rose from her chair, her face twisted in fury. You planned this, Olivia. You waited for the perfect moment to humiliate me. I met her rage with calm. No, Kate, you did that yourself. I just gave the truth a place to breathe. My father's hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened. His voice cracked, full of anger and disbelief. Enough of this. These are personal grievances, not business. Mr. Chen lifted a document, his expression grave. This is business. If even half of these claims are true, it is fraud on a scale that cannot be ignored. The secretary scribbled notes frantically, while whispers swept across the table. Maria turned toward me then, her voice soft but strong. Thank you for giving us the chance to be heard. I nodded, my throat tightening. You earned it. All of you did. The youngest scientist, no older than 27, looked at me with something I had never seen before from colleagues inside these walls. Respect. Gratitude. It steadied me in a way numbers never could. Kate's composure cracked. She lunged toward the evidence, grabbing at the pages, her voice rising to a scream. Lies. All of it. Lies. Security moved quickly, stepping inside the boardroom, their presence tall and unyielding. Kate froze her chest, heaving, her eyes darting from face to face as if searching for someone to defend her. Not one person spoke. My father's voice dropped low, bitter and strained. You will regret this, Olivia. You think exposing your sister makes you a hero. You are tearing this family apart. I turned to him, meeting the eyes that had dismissed me my entire life. No, Dad. The truth is, what tears lies apart. Family should have protected me. Instead, you tried to sell me. The words landed heavy, and for the first time my father did not answer. He looked down at the table, his face shadowed, his silence louder than any denial. The boardroom buzzed with tension, documents scattered across the polished wood, the stock ticker flashing higher on the screens. The future of Harper Dynamics had shifted, the balance of power moving right beneath their feet. I exhaled slowly, my grandmother's bracelet cool against my wrist, and watched as the weight of years of silence finally broke in front of me. When the board adjourned for a recess, I stepped out into the hallway, my head still buzzing with the weight of what had unfolded. The glass windows overlooked the city, the East River, glittering in the afternoon light, but I barely saw it. My heart beat steady now, the kind of rhythm that comes after a storm when the air is clear but charged. I heard footsteps behind me, slower, hesitant. When I turned, it was my mother. She no longer carried herself with the same polish she had worn at Christmas dinner. Her pearls were gone, her makeup faint, her face lined with something heavier than age. Olivia? She said softly, her voice frayed at the edges. I froze, not because of the sound of my name, but because of how small she looked. We stood in silence for a moment, until she moved closer, wringing her hands. I never thought it would go this far. I never thought your sister would do the things they say she did. I wanted to scoff, to tell her she had chosen not to see, but her trembling lips kept me still. You stood by them, I said, my voice even. Every time they dismissed me, every time they told me I was nothing, you stood there and said nothing. Her eyes welled with tears. I know, and I was wrong. I did not answer right away. Memories flickered, her voice echoing in my childhood, telling me to be practical, to be quiet, to stop embarrassing myself with impossible dreams. She had been my judge as much as my father. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thin folder. I found these in your father's study. I wanted you to have them. I hesitated, then took it. Inside were pages yellowed with time. My own drawings from when I was 12, diagrams of molecules, scribbled in pencil, taped together with notes scrawled in the margins. My chest tightened. He kept them, she whispered, even when he pretended not to care. I traced the lines of my younger self's handwriting, remembering the night I had stayed up drawing them under a single lamp, believing they would change the world. I looked up, my voice unsteady. Why are you showing me this now? Because, she said, her tears finally spilling, I do not want to lose both my daughters. I cannot undo what I did, but I can stand with you now if you will let me. The air between us felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong word. I wanted to push her away, to remind her that she had chosen her side too many times before. But something in her eyes, raw and unguarded, made me pause. I closed the folder gently. If you want to stand with me, then do it with action. The Harper Foundation has been funding country clubs and art galas for years. Redirect it. Fund young scientists. Give them the chance you never gave me. She nodded quickly, almost desperately. I will. Tell me how. For the first time I saw her shoulders lower, as though she was letting go of a weight she had carried for too long. The door opened down the hall, and board members began to file back in. My mother touched my arm before stepping aside. Her touch was tentative, almost like she was afraid I would pull away. Inside the boardroom, the tension was thicker. My father sat rigid, silent now, his fury barely contained. Kate's chair was empty, her absence as loud as her screams had been earlier. The rest of the board settled their folders, opened their pens ready. The secretary cleared his throat. We will resume. I stood the folder from my mother still in my hand and placed it on the table beside me. My voice was calm but carried across the room. Harper Dynamics cannot survive on theft and intimidation. It will survive on innovation, the way my grandfather intended. The screen behind me lit up with data projections and the beginnings of something I had kept locked away until now. Project Phoenix. A new foundation for the company built on the patents I had protected, staffed by the very people Kate had cast aside. The board members leaned forward, their eyes fixed, the hum of interest sparking around the room. My father shifted in his seat, his voice breaking through gravelly and tired. You think you can erase me from this company? I met his gaze evenly. Number. You erased yourself the moment you tried to sell what was not yours. The silence that followed was long broken only by the soft click of pens against paper. I felt the bracelet cool on my wrist again, a reminder of the woman who had believed in me when no one else had. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, steady and unwavering. The board's eyes were no longer on him. They were on me. The headlines hit the news before the meeting was even over. By the time I stepped out of the boardroom, my phone was vibrating non-stop with alerts. Quantum patent approved. Harper Dynamics stock soars 45%. $2 billion bidding war begins. Reporters crowded the lobby, their microphones raised like weapons, but security moved me quickly to a side exit. Outside, the winter air slapped against my face, cold and bracing. A black car waited, and when I slid into the back seat, I finally had a moment to breathe. My phone buzzed again, this time with a number I did not recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered, Miss Harper, this is Anna Mitchell with the Wall Street Chronicle. I need your comment on the patent approval and the board upheaval. I closed my eyes, briefly gathering my words. What do you want to know? Her voice was crisp, quick. How does it feel to have been dismissed by your own family only to become the most powerful shareholder overnight? I stared out at the city rushing by the bridges lit against the gray sky. It feels like the truth finally caught up. That is all, she pressed. And your sister, the accusations of corporate theft. Do you intend to pursue charges? I kept my tone steady. That is not for me to decide. The evidence is in the right hands now. The line went quiet for a second before she asked softly, "Were you hurt by what happened on Christmas?" The question struck deeper than I expected. I let out a breath, my throat tight. Hurt, yes. Surprised, no. When I hung up, the silence in the car felt heavy but clean. The city rolled past in flashes of light and shadow, and for once I did not feel small inside it. Back at my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and sank into the couch. The television blared with breaking news, my name crawling across the bottom of the screen. A panel of analysts debated my patents, their voices overlapping. Some called me a genius. Others warned of volatility. None of them knew me. None of them knew the years of quiet work, the tears on chalk-dusted hands, the nights on the lab floor, with only the hum of machines for company. Another buzz. An email this time. Subject line, Federal Interest. The Department of Defense requesting a briefing. My breath caught. The scale of it all was growing faster than I had imagined. I shut the laptop and stood pacing the length of my small living room. I thought of my father sitting rigid in his chair of Kate, clawing at the evidence of my mother whispering apologies in the hallway. The Harper name was plastered on headlines, but not for charity galas or mergers. For betrayal. For fraud. For the daughter they had tried to erase. The following morning, I walked into the office again. The building no longer felt the same. Employees looked up when I passed, some nodding, some whispering, but none ignoring me. The glass walls of the executive floor reflected a company in transition, its old guards shaken, its future uncertain. In the lobby, Anna Mitchell was waiting. This time she had credentials, not just a phone call. She walked beside me as security trailed discreetly behind. "The world is watching you," she said. "People want to know what you will do with all this power." I adjusted the strap of my bag and kept my pace steady. Power is not the point. Innovation Island. The world needs breakthroughs, not more smoke and mirrors. Her pen scratched across her notebook. "Do you think Harper Dynamics can recover from the scandal?" I stopped walking long enough to look her in the eye. "It is not recovering. It is transforming." She nodded once as if she understood and stepped back. Upstairs, the board convened again. The air was thick with tension, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of anticipation. They had seen the stock climb, the public's reaction, the undeniable weight of my patents. I placed my folder on the table, opened it to reveal the first phase of Project Phoenix. Projections filled the screen's, graphs climbing, timelines stretching into the future. The murmurs grew louder. "This is what Harper Dynamics should have been," I said, "not chasing after scraps or stealing from the talented, but building, creating, leading." The faces around me shifted, some skeptical, some intrigued, some already convinced. My father sat silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the table. He did not raise his voice this time. He had nothing left to fight with. As the meeting ended, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. I looked tired, older than my 30 years, but I also looked steady. My grandmother's bracelet glinted against my wrist, a quiet reminder of the promise I had kept. When I stepped back into the hallway, phones were buzzing everywhere. The world outside had already moved faster than we could keep up, but for the first time I was no longer chasing it. I was leading it. The sound of leather shoes striking the marble floor reached me before I saw him. A tall man in a dark coat stepped off the elevator, his badge glinting under the fluorescent light. He introduced himself to the receptionist, then his eyes found mine. "Agent Collins, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The entire executive floor seemed to hold its breath. Board members who had lingered outside the meeting room froze mid-step. Assistants lowered their voices to a hush. I straightened my bag heavy at my side, my pulse steady but quick. He walked toward me with measured steps. Miss Harper, I will need a moment of your time. Kate's voice cut across the silence before I could answer. She appeared at the far end of the corridor, her heels clattering, her face pale but defiant. What is this about? Agent Collins stopped, his tone even but firm. Catherine Harper, you are under investigation for corporate fraud, theft of intellectual property, and obstruction of federal inquiry. Gasps rose from the cluster of staff by the windows. Kate's face drained of the last trace of color. She turned to my father, who had just stepped out of the boardroom, his tie loosened, his eyes dark. Dad, do something. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, I saw him at a loss for words. Collins gestured, and 2 more agents stepped forward. Kate shook her head violently. You cannot do this to me. This is my company. Her voice cracked on the last word, echoing across the glass walls. Employees peered out from their offices, watching history undo itself in real time. I stayed where I was, my hands folded calmly in front of me. Inside, my heart pounded, but I did not let it show. One of the agents produced handcuffs, the metallic click slicing through the silence. Kate shrieked, stumbling back, her voice breaking. This is Olivia's fault. She set me up. She always wanted to ruin me. The words landed heavy, but no one rushed to defend her. Not even Richard. He stood rooted, his eyes locked on the floor. Years of command, of thunderous control had evaporated. He looked smaller, his frame hunched, his shoulders sagging under a weight of his own making. Kate fought as the agents took her arms, her manicured nails scraping against the polished wall. Security moved closer, guiding the cluster of curious employees back, giving the FBI room. As they passed me, Kate spat words through her tears. You will regret this. You think they love you now, but they will turn on you. Her face twisted with rage, then fear, before the elevator doors shut her away. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard finally lifted his head. His voice rasped, rough with defeat. You planned this. Every last piece of it. I met his weary eyes. I protected myself, and I protected the company you were willing to destroy. His lips trembled, but no words came. He turned back into the boardroom slowly, like a man walking into his own shadow. The board reconvened within the hour. The weight of what had just unfolded clung to every corner of the room. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, his voice formal. We have received federal confirmation of the investigation. Catherine Harper is suspended indefinitely. He looked at my father, then at me. Effective immediately, we require new leadership. Richard bristled, but the fire was gone from his eyes. The board members raised their hands one after another in silent vote. The majority had already shifted. I rose from my chair, my voice calm but certain. Harper Dynamics is not finished. It is beginning again. The words hung in the air, echoed by the hum of the stock ticker climbing still higher on the screen behind us. My father sat motionless, the papers in front of him untouched. When the vote was final, his retirement was no longer a choice. It was a fact. As the board members stood shaking hands, gathering their things, I remained by the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, the East River glinting in the fading afternoon light. For years, I had been invisible here, the quiet daughter, the overlooked scientist. Now the silence in the room was mine to command. I turned from the window as the last board member left, leaving me alone with the long table, the leather chairs, the scattered papers. The echoes of Kate's screams still lingered in the hall, and the shadow of my father's silence weighed heavy. But in the empty space that remained, I felt something else. Not fear, not anger. Possibility. I gathered my folder, slipped my grandmother's bracelet higher on my wrist, and walked out of the boardroom. The company was no longer theirs to lose. It was mine to lead. The first weeks after the board voted felt like stepping into a house I had lived in all my life but was finally allowed to rearrange. The locked offices were opened, the blinds pulled up, the walls that had made the executive floor feel like a fortress were replaced with glass. People who had walked past me without a glance now looked me in the eye. Some smiled, some were cautious, but all of them were watching. I spent long hours in the lab, not hidden away in a basement anymore, but standing alongside the scientists who had returned after years of exile. They carried cardboard boxes of old notes, family photos taped to monitors, coffee mugs they thought they would never see again. One by one, they unpacked their lives back into Harper dynamics, and with them came a spark that spread through the building. Dr. Rivera showed me the prototype laptop that ran on the quantum stability algorithm. She placed it on the table and let me touch the smooth metal surface, the hum of its circuits steady and sure. We ran a simulation in minutes that would have taken the world's most powerful supercomputer weeks. I felt a lump in my throat as the results scrolled across the screen. This was what I had been fighting for, not the board seat or the stock price, but the proof that quiet years of work could light up the world. Reporters still called, investors still circled, but I learned to filter the noise. When the Department of Defense sent a formal request, I read it carefully, then placed it in a separate folder. The applications for national security were obvious, but I refused to let my work become just another weapon. I wanted more than contracts and profits. I wanted cures, cleaner skies, stronger protections for the things people depended on every day. My mother visited me often now, never in pearls, always in quiet clothes that made her look softer, almost unfamiliar. She helped set up the foundation I had demanded from her in the hallway weeks earlier. We sat together in her kitchen, with stacks of grant applications spread across the table, reading stories from young scientists who reminded me of myself at 12. She cried sometimes when she came across drawings that looked like mine, simple pencil sketches of impossible ideas. We funded as many as we could. I rarely saw my father. The day his retirement became official, he left the building without ceremony. No speeches, no farewells. Just a man stripped of the throne he thought he could never lose. I heard later that he moved to a smaller house upstate, his days quiet and unremarkable. I did not hate him. I had no more room for that kind of weight. Kate's trial began in the spring. I did not attend, though I could have. The news covered every word, every exhibit, every tear she shed, when the evidence stacked too high for her to climb. She pled guilty in the end. Seeing her face on the screen, her makeup gone, her sharp edges dulled by prison walls, I felt no triumph. Only inevitability. She had sewn her own ending long before the agents placed cuffs on her wrists. The company thrived. Stock prices soared, yes, but more importantly, the labs hummed with life again. New departments sprouted, led by people who had once been told they were finished. Project Phoenix unfolded not as a slogan but as a reality, a rebirth built on something stronger than stolen credit or empty bravado. For the first time in decades, Harper Dynamics was not following. It was leading. One evening after a 12-hour day, I stood alone in my grandfather's old office, now mine. The sunset spilled across the city skyline, painting the East River gold. I looked at the patents framed on the wall, mine beside his, the lines of ink and ambition stretching across generations. His words came back to me, the ones he had left tucked into my trust fund letter. Watch out for the quiet ones. They are building revolutions. I touched my grandmother's bracelet on my wrist, cool and steady, and let the silence of the office wash over me. It was not the silence of being ignored anymore. It was the silence of arrival, of standing where I was always meant to be. That Christmas, almost a year after the dinner that had begun it all, I hosted my own gathering in the very dining room where they once dismissed me. The table was the same, the chandelier still gleamed, but the faces were different. My mother sat near the end, speaking warmly with Dr. Rivera. Researchers filled the chairs where board members had once smirked. Laughter replaced tension, and the clink of glasses carried no bitterness. When the dessert was served, someone raised a toast to Olivia for turning betrayal into brilliance. The words made me smile, but I lifted my glass not for myself but for all of them. To second chances, I said, and to never letting anyone tell us our work is worthless. The glasses clinked, not like weapons this time, but like a promise, and as I looked around that table at the people who had chosen to stand with me, I knew the revolution had only just begun. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or of the moments when you found your voice, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what part struck you most, and do not forget to like and subscribe so you can join me for more stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected turns. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I cannot wait to share the next one with you.